Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, ambiverts, a new type of person? You know what I mean? Actually, no, I don't, and nor do you. Exercising your opposite personality muscles. Is the convenience life we live damaging us? A discussion with Tom Cleary. Tom is a well-being and mental health consultant who specialises in mindfulness in education and business. Question of the week. What's the difference between ambivert and omnivert? A quick look at any introversion news items from this week. Just before we start, my comment on ghosting being debated in the Philippines Congress last week created a couple of comments. The summary of them was that being ghosted is never nice, but doesn't discussion on this as a legal issue debase many of the more relevant issues with how we treat people, such as introversion and other more serious diversity issues? But it did get kicked out of Congress. The Sun, not a paper I often read, but this week it defined a new type of personality. The ambivert. Yeah, I know. We've been talking about ambiverts for ages, but now the Sun is catching up. Adam Grant thinks that 50% of the population are ambiverts, which is a lot more than many others think. But what's the context, and what can we do with the information? Introvert-extrovert is a spectrum. Ambivert is a description for those who are not at one end or the other, but where you define the cutoff determines the percentages. In practical terms, the percentage might not help us. What's more important is an awareness of the signs and how to manage people differently. And that's what this show's all about. You know what I mean is a statement which often enters discussions. And it normally seems to mean I can't express what I mean, or I don't really know. The phrase has long annoyed me, but this week I seem to have heard it more than normal. I know I'm not immune either, but I do try hard not to use it and implore you to do the same. One extroverted leader trying to explain herself to her team during a 360-degree feedback session this week said, "You know what I mean." It really didn't help the conversation. It is not a substitute for proper explanation of what you feel or were attempting to do. Know what I mean? A recent article in The Guardian made me think about introverts staying at home rather than venturing out. It made me think of all the things we can now do from home, including work, without ever leaving home. For me, it was a reminder of the need to socialise, or the opposite, lest we lose the ability to do so. Getting a tin of chickpeas delivered to your door by a cyclist may seem convenient, but as well as the environmental costs of instant grocery delivery, they're not always delivered by cycle, let's be honest, let's add the personal social costs. If you're introverted, it is good to exercise socialising muscles, and extroverts do well to exercise quiet reflective skills more often. Small talk. It hit the Guardian front page yesterday. I've not read it all in detail yet, but I promise I will include this one next week. And finally, a silly but cute story of the week. It comes from New Zealand, where a young seal got into a back garden and climbed through 2 cat flaps, ending up terrorising the cat of the house. I just like the story, and my introversion link is tenuous, but it's about behaviour. The seal clearly lives in the sea, not a house, but can act differently at times. Just like introversion and extroversion are labels that don't have to define every person's every move, but will explain comfort zones. Let's move from the silly to the very sensible. Tom Cleary. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, John. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's really, really good to talk, so thank you for being here. In a moment, we're going to talk about, perhaps we'll touch on mindfulness, perhaps we'll certainly be talking, I'm sure, about self-compassion and some of the mental health issues that you see around in the workplace. But just before we get into all of that, you're an introvert, an extrovert, and what effect has that had on you?
Definitely introvert. I've had that label since I was very young, I think. And for me, it means that there are certain situations, especially social ones, which I find more challenging and which I find quite draining sometimes. And I'm somebody who definitely needs to have time by themselves to recharge from that. I've learned in my business that it affects the way that I network, that I have to put time aside to be able to do that. And also, my business started off by being one-to-ones. I actually find one-to-ones quite draining. So I then moved into working with groups where I can sort of bounce off energy between different people. So it's really shaped the way that my business works, I think.
That's really interesting, particularly the networking bit. Tell us a little bit about how you changed the way you network.
So I was somebody who, in addition to introversion, I was extremely shy, which doesn't always go hand in hand, but it did for me. And talking to people at all who were strangers was never going to be something which worked for me. And I had to, for my career, I went into leadership and I had to talk to the groups and give presentations. And I had to really work on that. And a side effect of it was I was then able to go into a room and to network and to talk. I find the small talk element difficult. I'll try and link in something which is actually much more meaningful when I go and speak to people. And I think that online networking's been a new world for me as well. So being able to meet people online and be able to do it from the comfort of my home works really well too.
Thank you. You're a mental health consultant, and I'm sure you've seen lots of common issues crop up in your work. And perhaps there's some linkage between introversion and extroversion, perhaps there isn't. But tell us a couple of key things that listeners could pick up on.
I think there is a link, and there is some research which shows this, but also from working with clients for several years now. A lot of my clients who would say they're more introverted tend to do a lot of analysis and sort of thinking about things over and over again.
I was going to say, that's certainly very true. Whether it's thinking about yourself or just being more analytical, that's certainly quite common.
Mm. It is, and sometimes that can lead to increased elements of anxiety and depression, depending on where those thoughts are focused. It's not something which is only obviously happening with introverts, but I think there are some cases where that you're more prone to certain conditions at times.
If I've got that right, too much self-analysis or self-talk, shall we say, can lead to not always, but can lead to a negative state of mind, which could lead towards depression.
It can do, and I think that this happened during lockdown as well, when a lot of introverts thrived because they were able to do things in their own way. They were able to shape their working environments to suit them a little bit more, whereas extroverts were left alone with their thoughts. So it was a sort of flip side to them. But a lot of clients I work with, and of course people come to me because they have something they want to work on. But it's often that kind of increased negative self-talk. And if they're getting some information from the world around them or from friends and family or colleagues or bosses, then actually they start to replay that, and that can lead down a path which isn't great.
In effect, I'm picking up that you're saying introverts can be more self-critical because of that self-talk.
It's something which definitely I see in my work. So extroverts can absolutely be self-critical. I wouldn't deny that at all. The people that I work with, introverts definitely have more negative self-talk. They have a bigger inner critic. They're able to kind of almost loop things continuously and talk themselves into not being as confident about things, about questioning things more, analyzing themselves and their weaknesses in a way which perhaps isn't constructive.
So what's the answer to that? Is that where the self-compassion comes in, or is it stop being self-analytical?
I think that being analytical is a really big skill and it's something which I value in myself. And it's something which led me to my own burnout before, which I realized in hindsight. And self compassion is, for me and for the clients I work with, a real game changer. And I'm somebody who is definitely, I'm not a warm, fluffy person. I'm not very kind of, I don't like hugging people. I don't like handshakes half the time as well. So the idea of self compassion didn't sit well with me at first, but it does make a huge difference because I know people who are so kind and caring to people around them, but the way they talk to themselves is it's horrible. It's really quite unpleasant. If you they start to kind of articulate their tone of voice, vocabulary, and the things that they tell themselves you wouldn't tell someone that you hated things like that sometimes. It's quite a strong thing.
Wow, that is really powerful then. What's the answer?
So when I start working with clients, I get people to start becoming more aware of the way that they talk to themselves. And that might sound like a silly thing to do because some people think, well, I'm highly aware, but actually sometimes things and certain sentences and words that we use become so commonplace, they become a backing track and we don't really pay attention to them. So I get clients to think about, is there a common phrase or word or sentence that you do when something's gone wrong or you think you haven't done well enough? And just start tuning into tone of voice you're using. And then can we just begin to start shifting that into I don't mean some kind of woolly, overly positive, life is magical and full of rainbows. I mean, can we be more realistic and more constructive with, okay, I got that wrong. Something didn't go well for me right now, but I can learn from that and I can build on that for later on.
Makes a lot of sense then, yeah. And I like the fact that, as you say, it's not just about coming out with positive statements in that fluff, it's just real world stuff. What we've been talking about very much then is introverts and being self-critical. Let's just spin that the other way for a second. If I was managing in my team some introverts, can I help them in this way?
Definitely. And I think that the biggest thing I see as a way of doing this is thinking about the way that feedback is given, is delivered, the structures in place to do that. And very often, the clients I work with, they're very good already at picking up on what they need to develop. So when they hear from somebody else in a very negative way, they can dwell on that. And that can become a kind of repeated loop, which doesn't lead to anything positive. So I work with a lot of leaders in terms of how can you give constructive feedback to somebody who is introverted in a way that actually helps to build up confidence and helps them to move forwards from that.
And what's the answer to that then? Because it's constructive, but I've seen I've seen lots of badly constructed feedback, I guess. But how can a leader make their feedback helpful?
It's being as neutral as possible because I think a lot of the time we give feedback with a lot of emotion behind it. So being very neutral and being very factual about, okay, this is the actual situation that's happened, and coming to feedback from getting it from the individual as well. So we've noticed this. How do you think we could do this together to improve that, to change that, to develop that? Because often introverts will have some fantastic ideas already for if they've seen something's gone wrong, they will have 12 different solutions, and actually talking that through can be really powerful rather than giving your opinion to somebody. Now, the person's opinion might be really useful and valid after they've discussed what the introvert has already thought of for themselves, which might actually be even more useful than the original kind of feedback thought was.
So unpick the other person's improvement ideas before just giving a whole 1,000 or 2,000 of your own, basically.
It is. And I know people who have really great intentions and also a lot of experience. So they're thinking, if I give my experience to this person, it's really going to help them. It's a great intention behind it. But if that doesn't land well with what the person's already thought about, there can be a clash immediately with that. Whereas if you go from it from another person's point of view, first of all, explore those things. And then if they haven't got that bit due to lack of experience, whatever it might be, adding it into there is going to be often better received as well.
Good point. And I guess the flip of that, because I implied, and I think you implied, that quite often feedback is maybe given with good intent, but it's badly constructed. How can I protect myself from badly given feedback?
I think putting things into context and thinking about things as being someone's opinion very often, thinking about how other pieces of feedback would support or possibly not support that feedback. So we put it into context too. And then if you have got a piece of feedback which is actually valid, rather than going through again and again and sort of retuning over your mind that particular sentence, thinking about what's the first action point I can make in order to then move across and develop in that.
So look for the context and in particular look for patterns then.
Yes, very much.
Love it. So perhaps it's a good time to ask if you give us one quick tip for an introvert and one tip for a leader of introverts.
So for introvert, it would be just start becoming aware of that kind of inner critic and recognize the tone of voice that you're doing. If that can be a first starting point that you can start working on. And then if you can, explore self-compassion. So Kristen Neff is a fantastic way of doing that. but the awareness, and then start looking at techniques you can do to support you.
Brilliant, thank you. And flipping it the other way around, as a leader, how can I help my introverts?
I would say to take a moment to reflect on how the feedback you have given has landed in the past. And if you are open to it, actually asking people in your team that you manage how they feel about it. Very often I've seen leaders completely reshape feedback policies and programs and support based on getting much more honest feedback from people they've given it to over the past few months.
I really like that. So get feedback on your own feedback giving.
Yes, basically.
Sounds a bit convoluted, but it makes so much sense. Thank you. Tom, I'm absolutely convinced that some of the listeners are going to be saying, I want to get back in touch with Tom. What's the best way to do that?
LinkedIn is great for me. So if you type in Tom Cleary Coaching, you will find me on there. Or the website is tom-cleary.co.uk.
Fantastic. It's been marvellous talking to you today. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much, Don. Thank you.
My main takeaways from that great discussion were the importance of self-compassion. At least treat yourself as well as you treat your friends. Be more aware of how you talk to yourself, especially common phrases you use on yourself. Number 3. Constructive feedback needs to build confidence. Use facts, not emotions, and help the other person create their answers rather than just giving yours. Number 4. Receiving feedback. Consider the context and look for patterns in all the bits of feedback you get, rather than just accepting all feedback as a damaging truth. What were your takeaways? Add to a discussion at the Facebook page, Activate Your Introvert. Add to a discussion at the Facebook page, Activate Your Introvert. What would you like to know about introversion in business? This week's question comes from the website, activateyourintrovert.co.uk. Go ask your question there, and I'll answer it. What is the difference between Ambivert and Omnivert? It's a great question, so thank you. Firstly, I'll say that some people don't think that omniverts exist, and some people debate the term ambivert. But then, some people think introverts are just silly, shy snowflakes, whilst wondering why their teams don't perform well. But let's go for it anyway. Introvert-extrovert is a spectrum, and for me, the relevance of knowing where you are on that spectrum, and more importantly, where those you're trying to influence exist, is to improve your communication and influencing skills, ultimately improving productivity. Far too few managers and leaders consider the introverted 30 to 40% of their teams when wondering how to improve productivity and creativity. An introvert can learn tactics to appear more extroverted and work more effectively in a world which has an extrovert bias. An extroverted leader can learn skills to help them work more effectively with introverts. It's about learning situational tactics rather than just assuming you are the limits of your label and can't go beyond them. But ambivert, someone whose behaviour is between introversion and extroversion. What the percentage of intro, ambi or extrovert is depends on your cut-off point. And the only relevance of that is how you use the information to influence others or yourself. The Latin origins of the prefix ambi means two of a pair, or both. Omniverts exhibit signs of both extroversion and introversion. The prefix omni has Latin roots meaning all, universally. So omniverts, should we accept that they exist, are those who can easily move between the extremes at will. In other words, you may be genetically predispositioned to be at one end or the other, and that can be as simple as your tolerance of dopamine and acetylcholine, as we've discussed before. However, you probably learned skills to be able to slide up and down the scale. Maybe this just means you've learned from this show for the last 3 years. What question would you like answered? Whether you want to be on the show or just have your question answered, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk, where there's a box for you to ask your question. You could also follow on Facebook and discuss the answers at the show's page. Activate Your Introvert.
I'm John Baker, Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintroversion.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.